Hello, everyone. My name is Tom Dillon. I work for Regenerate Outcomes. So we sponsor the mentoring program by Understanding Ag, and alongside that, we baseline and monitor and verify the soil carbon stocks, which we'll be hearing more about this evening. We have 4 presenters this evening, each bringing a wealth of knowledge about carbon. So we'll go through the presentations, and then if people want to have questions, put them in the chat and we'll cover those questions at the end, just to keep things rolling. So the first will be by Blaine Yetas. Blaine is an experienced regenerative farmer from Western Canada and an understanding ag consultant. Blaine will be discussing soil carbon and its role in driving plant and animal and soil health. And Blaine will be passing it, well, we'll then move on to Sophie Caff from Eurofins, which is the largest lab in Europe, I believe now, Sophie. But essentially, Sophie will be talking about some of the tests which we run as part of our program, and that includes measuring active carbon, which Sophie will discuss. And then we'll pass on to Dr. Jordan, my colleague from Regenerative Outcomes, who will talk about how if you can baseline and verify increases in soil carbon stocks, you can generate carbon credits to a high standard. And then we'll then pass on to Bill Goldie from Redshaw Advisors, who are a leading carbon broker house based in London. And Bill will be talking about the carbon markets more broadly and where agriculture might fit in there. So we'll have the questions at the end, but by all means put them in the chat in the meantime. And Blaine, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to start right off by sharing my pictures here, I hope. Does that come up there? You got a full screen now? Yes? Okay.
Yep.
All right. So thank you very much for the introduction. I apologize for my Canadian accent. I'll try and speak slow and clear so you can kind of get the gist. So I've been farming for 49 years. The last half of my career, I've been in regenerative agriculture. I'm also a certified holistic educator, and I also work for Understanding Ag as a soil consultant. So the topic that I was given was confused about carbon. So I'm just going to share a couple of real quick things. Carbon is, or carbon dioxide and carbon sometimes get slightly mixed up. So I use this little diagram right here. It's basically two molecules of oxygen that tie on to carbon. 12 and 16, so our molecular weight when we add them up is 44, and then you divide the 12 by 44 and you come up with this number here of 27.2%. And you'll see that number go back and forth, and that's why carbon is always a smaller number than CO2. So when you look at the physics of the stuff, if you took 1 kilogram of carbon, it would weigh 0.4, or it would use up the space of 0.44 liters. If you took 1 kilogram of CO2, it would take up 505 liters of space, or 1,147 times more space. So I don't know about in your country, but in my country, we have all kinds of engineers who are all excited about geosequestering. My answer to that one is this right here, that using a green leaf uses the sun's energy and does exactly the same thing for free. So the solution to our mess is more green in the world. It's that simple. This idea of using technology and trying to geosequester, I believe, is not going to get us very far. So just looking at where carbon is in the world, we have about 750 billion tons up in the atmosphere, 550 billion tons in the biosphere, in the plants, us, the bugs, everything living. And then in the soil, the pedosphere, we have about 2,300 billion tons. And we also have the largest reserve of all is the oceans. They have way more than all of this together. So they are by far the hugest store of carbon on our planet. It's estimated that since the Industrial Revolution, we've taken about 136 billion tons from here and moved it up to here by the way we farm, what I call degenerative agriculture. So this is basically as simple as I can make it, showing how the process works. So we have sunshine shining here on green leaves. These green leaves make photosynthesis, and they take CO2 and water, and they make C6H12O6, which is glucose. That glucose goes down into here, and it actually leaks out into this area here called the rhizosheath. And so there's a feeding frenzy here. All of the life in the soil tends to congregate around roots, plant roots in this rhizosheath. So basically the plant then is leaking sugar out from, it worked hard with photosynthesis, leaked this sugar out, and it might seem kind of wasteful, but really what the plant is doing, it's a symbiotic relationship that has existed for 420 million years on our planet. In fact, the bugs came onto the soil before the plants could. So this feeding then, the plant says, hey guys, you got free lunch. I need some zinc or boron or whatever it is the plant needs. It's extremely complex communication. Soil microbiologists will tell you that they understand very little of it yet. The fancy word is quorum sensing. And so the plants, this is their preferred method of feeding. These are arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. You can see how they actually physically attach to the root, the arbuscular part of them. And these things are huge. They've measured individual species in Oregon covering over 1,000 acres. So, you know, the old question used to be, what was the biggest animal on the planet? We used to say blue whale, but actually it's mycorrhizal fungi. So these things are huge. So by the way we farm, if we're using tillage and high rates of synthetic fertility, it tends to be very negative to these guys. And the other way that plants feed is through a process called rhizophagy, where they actually literally take these bacteria, suck them in through the cell. Through superoxidation, they actually take the energy out of the cytoplasm, and then they spit the bacteria out. The bacteria are still alive, and they can go around and recycle like that. So that's how plants feed. So it's really important to remember that in agriculture. We've tended to forget this in agriculture. We forgot this part. This is absolutely critical to success if we're going to be regenerative in our approach. So how do we know it works? This is how you tell. You dig a plant up and take a look, and you can see the association here between, you know, the microbes, the soil, and the plant roots. When I graduated a good long time ago, I was taught that the roots should be beautiful, clean, and white. That was what I was taught, but that is not accurate. We want to see this kind of stuff here. When we see this, we know things are going good. So these are the regenerative principles. I'm sure you guys have heard them many times, but they bear repeating. We have to get them into here before we're going to be successful. So the first one is the context. And that's basically where your farm is, what you're trying to do, what type of soil, all those things, financial considerations, etc. I don't have time to get into that today. But we want to keep a living root as long as possible. We want to have diversity. We want to have armor on our surface. We want to minimize our disturbance and animal incorporation. So I'm just going to take a minute and go through each one of these and kind of talk about why they're important. So diversity is absolutely critical to success. So this little picture right here explains it really well. So here we have, you know, what most of us do in farming is we have monoculture. So you think about how these plants grow. Every one of them germinates on the same day. They all need whatever it is, nitrogen or phosphorus or zinc or whatever. They're all going to need it on the same day. So there will be deficiencies. If an insect comes along, it's going to be in heaven because every plant is the same and it goes, woohoo, I got a free lunch here. You contrast this here, the way Mother Nature created the system. And it's incredible. There is nothing here that is growing on the same day. They share resources. All of these roots are all interlinked between the fungi. They're sharing resources. We used to be taught that plants compete. They actually work together. And so when you start to get diversity, it's absolutely incredible how things start to hum. So it's probably the biggest thing that we can do is try to figure out rotations that get more diversity into our system. So more jobs get done when we have diverse roots. We've learned now, when I graduated again, I was taught that if you put armor or litter on the surface, that's how you build organic matter. That is not accurate anymore. living rube inputs, those sugar glucose exudates coming out of the plants from photosynthesis, are 2 to 13 times more efficient than litter in farming that soil organic carbon. So if we want to put carbon into our soil, we need to have diversity and keep it green longer. More roots gives you more soil carbon. That's how simple it is. So just a couple pictures here in the part of the world where I live. That's a quad right there. This particular fellow was grazing this very diverse mixture, but you can see that that's humming. The insect life, the bird life, the amount of carbon going in was absolutely incredible in that picture. Just another picture of a polycrop, same thing, just incredibly, it just makes, it's unbelievable to me how dense they can get and how these plants work together. So one of the other principles then is to keep it green longer. So in my part of the world, we're a little colder than you are. We have about 120 frost-free days. Most of the crops that we grow are spring wheat and canola, are the two main crops. And those two crops are green for about 70 days where they're actually photosynthesizing. So we have, in my cold part of the world in Saskatchewan here, we have about 260 days of potential to capture sunshine. Even late March into December, I have measured photosynthesis happening on my farm in my cold part of the world. So if we're only growing a crop for 70 days, and I tend to get really grumpy when I don't eat for a couple of days, never mind for 190 days. So if we aren't feeding the microbes underneath our feet, our soil health is actually going to be declining. We're going to be taking carbon out of our system and putting it back up into the atmosphere because these bugs are still alive. They're going to start chewing on organic matter. So we have to be thinking about that in our approach to agriculture and think about ways that we can keep it green as long as we possibly can. So the next principle then is to minimize disturbance. So tillage is the most common one we think of. This is getting to be a relatively rare practice in my part of the world, but it still does happen occasionally. Overgrazing is disturbance. If you aren't giving your plants adequate time to recover, graze them off and then get the animals gone. And, I don't know what it is in your country, but in my part of the world here, we want to be at least 90 to 120 days between grazings. We want to give those plants lots of time to recover before we come back and graze them again. So if you're continually overgrazing, that is disturbance. Monoculture is a huge disturbance. In my part of the world, the prairie that my grandfather came here from Norway many, many years ago to start farming, there was probably 250 to 300 different species on that prairie grass, forbs, legumes, etc. Very, very diverse. He took the plow and in one stroke, he simplified that. And we've been growing wheat and canola ever since. There is huge consequences to soil life when we simplify things like that. So if we want to become regenerative and begin putting that carbon back into the soil, we need to think about what we can do. So whether it's, there's nothing wrong with growing the monoculture, but what can we put in front of it or what can we put behind it? Or maybe we can put something with it. And the other thing that's a disturbance is high rates of synthetic fertility. If you're pouring high rates of nitrogen on, that tends to be very negative to soil health. It's a disturbance. So these are all things to be thinking about. Another principle then is armor. And I like to use the analogy of skin on our bodies. If I took this hand here and put it into a fire for a minute, the doctor would probably come along in a day or two with a sad long face and say, sorry, Blaine, we got to cut your hand off. This stuff we call skin is absolutely critical for my success as an organism. Keeps me warm, keeps me cool, all those kind of functions it does. It keeps pathogens out, it keeps moisture in. Think about the surface of our soil exactly the same. We have to have that armor on there if we're going to be successful. Down in the southern part of the United States where Shane is from, they're just experiencing ridiculous amounts of heat. And if you don't have armor on your soil, the consequences are huge. And I'll just show you with this. This is up in my country. We're a lot colder. But this is a handheld laser thermometer. So the air temperature that day was 25. The bare soil on the bottom left was 55.1, 30 full degrees C above the air temperature. The litter on the top right was virtually the same, 52. And so then I just took my fingers and I scraped away the litter and took a temperature. and it's considerably cooler. It's slightly warmer than the air, but not much. And so if you think about that, you know, what's happening to the moisture here? It's evaporating. What's happening to the soil life? Once we get much above 40 degrees C, soil bacteria and stuff start basically shutting down or dying. So if we need to have those guys working for us. If we're killing them with heat, you know, they aren't going to be very productive. And the other thing that happens is we have a rainfall event on bare soil. We have this type of action is happening. Every raindrop comes, it hits the earth pretty hard. We've all probably been out in rainstorms where we've had, you know, a good bit of, it hurts our skin a little bit when we do that. And that's what happens to the soil. It looks like a hand grenade going off. And so that the effect of that coming up and down and thousands of times per second is like making this sealed right off like a piece of plastic. The water cannot infiltrate. And so you can say, wow, I had a 25 millimeter rain, but if 50 or 30 or 20 of it ran off, it's not very effective. So we need to figure out how, when we do get rain, we need to figure out how to make it go into our soils. And then the next principle then is having these creeps here. Doesn't need to be every year. Maybe it's once every 4 years in a rotation, whatever it is. We need to have these guys running across the landscape. And I'm going to use the word cows, but it can be goats, it can be sheep, it can be bison, doesn't matter. Ruminant animals. And so they do all sorts of wonderful things. There's microbes on every leaf. So these cows are eating those microbes. They're walking 100 meters and then they poop some of it out and they're spreading microbes around. They can take some of this deader grass here. If I left that laying on the surface here, it would probably take a year before that would recycle, depending on how dry it is. It might even take several years. I can run that through the rumen on my cow and I can recycle that in 3 days. So we can really increase biological time by running animals. And we tramp this litter down so that it can then begin to be the process of decomposition. And the other thing that happens when animals graze is they wrap around with their tongue, they lift. And so that tends to break rootlets. So we get a sugar release, which creates a feeding frenzy, which then promotes more life. So these guys are pretty important to the whole thing. So basically we're transferring carbon into the soil as exudates from the growing roots. The roots slough carbon-rich materials when they're grazed, which are approximately 58% carbon by weight. And then we have to have that regrowth to give adequate plant recovery. So this right here is kind of the end of my little talk. So the soil on the right-hand side looks pretty good, nice and black. And that would be the kind of the soil that my grandfather inherited when he came to the prairies back 110 years ago. It was 12% organic matter, deep, rich, black, and that soil had 60% space in it. 10% organic matter gives you 60% space. After about almost 100 years of my grandfather, my father, and myself, we managed to get it to about like this, along with just about virtually every other farmer in the world. We took the carbon and we farmed it out by some of those things I've just described. And the consequences of that is we now have 25% or extremely compacted soil. When we have compacted soil like this, we got big troubles. We can't get water in, we can't get roots in, you know, we can't get air in, we can't get any of those kind of things that are critical for life. And so this is the way we have farmed for 10,000 years. We went from here to here, which is degenerative. The good news is that we have now figured out how to go from here back to here. That's what regeneration is all about. So it's pretty exciting to think about finally, after 10,000 years of degenerating soils around the world, we have now finally figured out how to begin the process of regenerating them. And if we do this, we're going to also solve our climate problems. And we're going to put a lot of carbon back into that soil. So I think that's pretty well my 15 minutes. So I think I will stop right there and mute myself, and thank you.
Thank you, Blaine. That was really interesting. Just conscious of time, so I'm your next speaker today, so I'll jump straight into it. I'll just share my screen, so please let me know if you can see it. Bear with me. Hopefully you can see that.
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. So thank you for inviting me onto the webinar today. Some of you might be aware already that Eurofins is one of the labs that Regenerate Outcomes is working with in their programme. So appreciate my talk today isn't solely carbon focused, but I've been asked to speak briefly about some of the tests included by Eurofins within the Regenerate Outcomes project and how they are carried out. So Tom briefly mentioned it, but just a bit of background. We're the largest analytical services business in the world, divisions in a wide range of areas such as food and feed, pharmaceuticals, agri-science, genomics, forensics, and so on. So that's over 900 laboratories. We've got over 61,000 employees. And for the agricultural sector, we are also the largest agro testing business in Europe. Now, there are two key tests that Regenerate are using in part of their programme. One is the Fertilisation Manager, one is our Soil Life Monitor, and also active carbon tagged onto that. So I'm just going to briefly explain a bit of what these reports contain and how they're useful to you, and also explain some of the methodologies behind that. So here is some snips of the Fertilisation Manager. And this packages up the chemical, physical, and biological soil characteristics in one report. So firstly, we've got the chemical. So we're looking at the major nutrients and the trace elements. But the key thing here is we're showing what is plant available as well as soil stock, because nutrients are not always at the same levels of availability to a plant. So we differentiate the two. Secondly, physical attributes, such as your cationic exchange capacity, your CEC, organic matter, soil structure, and some useful KPIs regarding soil crumbling, slaking, and the risk of erosion. And thirdly, some biological characteristics too, such as your microbial biomass, microbial activity, and the fungal to bacterial ratio. Now, we really understand the need for insights from reporting to be actionable and not just numbers. So within the reports, we provide a number of different elements which have interpretive data. So, for example, there is fertilization advice here. Now, I appreciate that from a regenerative ag perspective, many may have the view of not applying chemical inputs. But this just gives insight into the nutrition that a crop requires from an agronomic optimum. Appreciate that you can get plant nutrients in lots of different ways, most likely in a regenerative way, by really pulling that through the biology of the soil. But so, yeah, we give guidance on the nutrition a crop needs, as well as a whole section on organic matter. So this graph here on the top right, it shows an organic matter balance, which helps you quantify how to maintain, or most likely we all want to build organic matter levels. Bottom right here, it looks at the quality of the organic matter. Now, organic matter, it mainly consists of carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. And if organic matter is dynamic, it may deliver a lot of nitrogen and sulfur, but a stable organic matter may have more carbons, and that's going to help more with the structure of the soil, the workability. So having this insight just helps you understand what's in your soil and therefore how you can manage it. Also offers some infographics such as water holding capacity, soil structure, and soil texture, which are all really important factors in determining the overall health of your soil. So how do we do this? There's a lot of information that are within those reports. and we use a method called near-infrared spectroscopy to gather all of this information. I won't go into too much depth, but in case you're unaware, near-infrared spectroscopy, also known as NIR, it's an analytical technique, and it uses a source-producing light of a known wavelength pattern, and that enables you to obtain a complete picture of the organic composition of that analysed substance or material. So, well, what does that actually mean? Well, in the electromagnetic spectrum, the near-infrared light, it lies between your visible light and near-infrared. So you can't see near-infrared, but you can feel it as heat. And near-infrared light has the advantage that relatively little light is absorbed, making it possible to analyse samples directly without any dilution or other pre-treatments. So it's a really useful analytical technique as different molecules absorb and reflect near-infrared light to different extents. So what we can do is analyse how much light is absorbed back, and essentially different molecules absorb and reflect light to different levels, and when molecules absorb energy from near-infrared light, it's converted into kinetic energy. So the more light that's absorbed, the less light is going to be reflected. So what we've done over the last 20 years is learn how to interpret this NIR by calibrating it to reference methods. So your standard wet chemical methods that you would see in a laboratory. So it's an indirect analysis, but the real benefit here is it allows us to quickly and economically, but indirectly measure using very accurate calibrations. So the result is you do get the same results through NIR as you would wet chemistry, but we can routinely report over 100 soil characteristics using this method. You can see on the right here, this photo, that's what the sample would look like. And the jar slowly rolls over the beam of light. So of course we can gather lots of different characteristics, but you can see here it's ground down soil which has been dried. So when you turn it over that beam of light, it has quite a large surface area. And because it's dried down to a set temperature, we can store it for a period of time, meaning if you do need to reanalyze, we can do that. So one of the key aspects to say, though, is near-infrared is very, very powerful, but it's only as good as your calibration data set is. And on that front, we've been calibrating for over 20 years using this. I won't go into too much detail about how calibrations work, but it basically means that we can achieve this high level of accuracy in under 20 seconds. Here's just a graphical representation of the validity of the key carbon-based parameters versus their wet chemical reference methods that we use via NIR. So with our fertilisation manager, that's the NIR, we gather a lot of information from that for the reports. But for the plant available nutrients, we can't do that via NIR. So we use a method called calcium chloride. And this is a particularly weak extraction. So it shows what's truly available to the crop right now on a key range of parameters, such as your key macro and micronutrients. So that was talking about our fertilisation manager, our holistic package, which encompasses your biological, chemical and physical characteristics. But clearly, being regenerative outcomes, it's all about regenerative agriculture, and the soil biology is such a key part. So we are also offering our more in-depth biological analysis, which we call our soil life monitor. Now, you may have heard of phospholipid fatty acid analysis, or PLFA for short. Our soil life monitor packages up the PLFA analysis. and we can gather a number of different parameters using this. So I'll just go into that. Here's an actual example of how we've used PLFA, because biology, people haven't really been measuring biology much, and it's very hard to get a benchmark. So we have had examples of where people have compared your middle of a field versus your hedgerow. As you can see here, most of the figures are much higher under the hedgerow, as you would expect. So it's a really good tool for benchmarking, looking at what could be biologically possible in that field in the future, perhaps if you stick to those regenerative practices. So just to shine into what phospholipid fatty acid analysis is, so cell membranes of living organisms, they consist of different fatty acids, and different groups have a unique composition of fatty acids. So by analysing the fatty acids, not only are we able to identify the living organisms only, but as different groups have different compositions, it enables us to determine more detail about the soil life. And these are some examples of some of the parameters that we can determine, such as total bacteria, total fungi, protozoa, fungal to bacterial ratio, and the PLFA diversity index, which is also known as the Shannon index. But it goes down further as well. So it doesn't just determine the totals. We can break this down into gram positive, gram negative, and the actinomycetes. And just an example, actinomycetes, they help with nutrient cycling and degradation of complex organic matters. And saprophytes, they live and feed on dead and decaying organisms. Now, on the back of the report, it does list out all of these characteristics and explains what saprophytes, for example, do. So when you can go through that and look at your results, it really gives a whole new level of insight into soil life, which, using more traditional methods of analysis, such as looking through a microscope, it's much more tricky to deliver on a routine basis. Well, thank you for listening. That was a real a quick snapshot into lab analysis of looking at more in-depth testing. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sophie. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this evening. So my name's Matt Jordan. I'm a sheep and beef farmer from Northumberland, and also scientific officer at Regenerate Outcomes. So I'm going to talk to you this evening about how you go from looking at the carbon in your soil to then generate verified carbon units from that. So Blaine's done a really good job of introducing the carbon cycle and how we can use the 6 principles of soil health to influence that on our operations. And Sophie's given us a really helpful understanding of how we can interpret some of what's going on in that soil to then refine our observations and management off the back of that from the lab. But I'm going to kind of take a step back and consider more the kind of sum of the carbon within your soils, and then how we can go about measuring the increases your regenerative management is achieving to then generate carbon units from that. So I'm going to talk briefly around why carbon credits are important, touch on the forms of carbon in the soil that are relevant for thinking about carbon credits, talk you through the process of turning carbon into credits, and then unpack a little bit what we mean by verified carbon. So there's a couple of really great reasons for us as farmers to think about carbon, and Blaine has really helped us think carefully about the first of these, which is the role of carbon as a management tool. So its importance in building soil structure in terms of providing that basis for microbial activity, which builds your soil aggregates, releases nutrients, improves water infiltration, and that side of things. And so carbon credits aside, carbon is important for farmers to be thinking about and managing for as part of having that profitable and resilient farming operation. But the second reason that there's so much noise and fuss, if you like, about carbon at the moment is because since the Industrial Revolution, we've put a lot of carbon into the atmosphere through burning fossil fuels. And so the kind of key reason why there is a market for these carbon credits is because farms can play a role in pulling carbon back out of the atmosphere and storing it stably in the soils. So on that kind of climate change front, how can farmers help? Well, there's two kind of key ways. And the first is removing emissions from the atmosphere, and the second is reducing sources of on-farm emissions. So just to cover those really briefly, as Blaine was describing, we can be really firing up our soil biology and plant photosynthesis activity to be storing carbon dioxide through photosynthesis as sugars, and then structural plant compounds, which can leak into the soil through root exudates, be laid down on the soil through plant material. And that can then be stably stored in the soil. And this kind of emissions removal process is the same thing that happens when you plant a tree, right? You're storing carbon in a stable form using a living thing. And then there's the emissions reduction side of things, and a lot of these come with a transition to agriculture. So, for example, if we're doing less field operations, less cultivation operations, we're using less red diesel. That's resulting in less CO2 being released from machinery. Around the methane front, quite a sensitive issue around livestock, but there's lots of really good wins we can have there in terms of improving livestock efficiency. So it's things around increasing the number of calves weaned for cows put to the bull. Those sorts of things where it's better for our bottom line and it's better for the planet are really kind of worth fine-tuning over the years as part of thinking more broadly in the business about moving down that regenerative route. And there's these kind of other ways we can help tighten things up as well that help bring down some of these other sources of emissions. And then the final one, nitrous oxide. So a lot of nitrogen fertilizer that's applied, the nitrogen that immediately volatilizes back into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide gas. So, as we're using less nitrogen fertilizers, it's saving the cost of buying the stuff, but it's also helping reduce that source of emissions. So to move more to focus on soil carbon. So it's worth remembering that, we talk about the carbon in the soil. It's worth bearing in mind that that is a dynamic cycle. So I like to think of it as a bank balance. There's a certain amount in the bank, and then there's money coming in and out all the time. And so, Blaine's already touched on these, but there's a whole bunch of ways that we can get carbon in the soil through our management. So that's, sugars leaking from plant roots, these root exudates, plant roots and how they kind of slough off and die into the soil kind of on that growth cycle. Laying down above ground biomass, whether that's trampling forage through livestock impact or crop residues or whatever that might be. The dunging action of livestock, and then obviously we can also apply manure. And then the microbes, which form part of the amount of carbon in the soil and play a really important role in turning some of these other forms of carbon inputs into more stable forms within the soil. But these microbes are also using these carbon inputs as a source of energy for themselves. And so they're respiring out carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And so you've got these kind of our management processes which are adding carbon into the soil, microbes cycling some of that back out. And essentially what we're trying to do through our regenerative management is skew the balance in. So fire up particularly the top four of these processes to be getting more carbon into the soil, which, yes, fires up that microbiology, but is helping build up the total amount of carbon present there. So to go into more depth on that, so the soil organic matter, which we see on a lot of our lab tests, and on average, although there's obviously that variation in kind of quality that Sophie was talking about, roughly 50% of that soil organic matter is carbon containing. And it's worth bearing in mind that soil carbon reaches what's called an equilibrium under a given management approach. So say you've got a permanent pasture that's been set stocked with sheep, that field will have reached an equilibrium in soil carbon. So the amount of carbon you're adding in is matching the amount of carbon being cycled out by the microbes. And you can you can increase up to an equilibrium, or you can decrease down to an equilibrium depending on your management. But for a given management that stays constant over, say, 20 to 30 years, you will get to a point where you're not seeing much change in the carbon present. This also relates to a second kind of related but different concept around saturation. So you hear a lot of people talking about how soils get to a point where they can't physically hold any more carbon. And this is partially true, but not the whole story. So there's, for the purposes of this, there's kind of two main pools of carbon within the soil. The first is bound to minerals. And so people often talk about how high clay soils can sequester more carbon. This is because you've got more mineral binding sites on clay that through microbial activity, you can stably bind organic matter to. But then there's a second form of carbon in the soil, which is called particulate organic matter. And that's your kind of semi-decomposed plant residues in the soil. And so this is some really nice data from Europe. I don't normally use graphs, but please bear with me with this one. So on the bottom, you've got soil carbon, and obviously soil and carbon increases as you move from left to right. And on the vertical here, you've got mineral associated organic matter. And what you see basically is that you get to a point where your mineral associated organic matter can't increase any further. It kind of occurs about here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but basically where the line levels off. And so that's the point at which all your mineral binding sites, all your clay particles have a bit of organic matter stuck to them. You can't get any more mineral organic matter in the soil. But what's really interesting here is that obviously there's a huge amount of scope to increase carbon beyond that mineral organic matter saturation point. And so that's really encouraging for a lot of us as farmers, particularly people who've been doing a good job managing their soil over a number of years, that there's this still potential to increase carbon further through building up that particulate pool. You know, Understanding Ag have been implementing the 634 to great success across North America for over 30 years and still aren't seeing a plateau in terms of improvements in performance. And it's, you know, particularly in academia, you get a lot of people kind of saying, well, soils saturate, and so there's a limit to how much good can be done. Well, you know, there's some really powerful evidence to suggest that there is continued potential in most situations. So that's a bit around kind of soil carbon itself, turning it into credits. So to go through some more terms, because there's a lot of confusion around these, your carbon stock is what you've got, and that's typically expressed as tons of carbon per hectare. And so it's what's in your field at the moment is your carbon stock. And then there's this related concept around sequestration, and that's the kind of rate of increase. So if you're sequestering carbon, you're removing it from the atmosphere. And that's expressed generally as tons of carbon dioxide removed per hectare per year. And so to give you an example, you know, you might have a carbon stock of, say, 60 tons per hectare and have a sequestration rate of 2 tons per hectare. So your stock is gaining by 2 tons per year. And it's quite important to be clear around these, because often people say, oh, well, I've got a really high carbon stock, I must be sequestering a lot. It's not, the two don't necessarily go together. Your stock kind of reflects geology and your historical management, and your sequestration rate would reflect what you're doing now. So what is a carbon credit? Well, it's quite simply 1 ton of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere, or it could be expressed in terms of emissions avoided. If you're, say, using less red diesel, that could then translate into carbon not sequestered, not emitted, if you like. So carbon credit, 1 ton of carbon dioxide. And so there's a lot of talk about getting a baseline in place. Your baseline is your current status. It's what you've got now. It's your stock at the moment, and then your credits are generated as change from that baseline. So, you know, we're going on to farms at the moment, measuring their soil carbon. That's their baseline stock, and then we'll be looking to measure the rate of sequestration, the rate of change from that baseline. So to go into some detail about how we measure carbon. So we use an outfit called Agricarbon that have some really impressive high kind of capacity coring buggies, and then an automated lab, which is really helpful to kind of keep the cost of this low, because it is quite an expensive procedure. And so we take soil cores down to from 0 to 30 centimeters, and then again 30 to 60 centimeters to kind of capture what's going on across the depth of the soil profile. Obviously on shallower soils, we'll just go as far as we can. And then those cores are taken back to the lab and analysed for the percentage of carbon, so grams of carbon per kilogram of soil, and then the density of the soil. You know, how many grams of soil are there per centimetre cubed, and you times these two things together along with the sampling depth, and that gives you your stock, your tons of carbon per hectare. the real trick with soil carbon sampling is managing the variation across the field and the farm. So, pulling the cores and analysing them is kind of the easy bit. And the real trick comes in designing the sampling program and the placement of cores to kind of capture and manage the high variability that's present within soils. And then typically we'll be looking to resample carbon every 5 years to detect the rate of change from that baseline. And so, this process, there's rigor involved in every stage to get it right and ensure a really high quality data product that can then be used to generate carbon credits. So going now on to the process of verifying carbon. So there's a bunch of things you need in place in order to be able to verify carbon. And that's kind of what the Regenerate program helps farms to get together. So the first of that is your management records. So we'll ask farms to complete logbooks, kind of, as you're implementing regenerative practices, keeping a note of what's going on when. So, say someone starts to integrate cover crops, what did they sow, when did they sow it, when and how did they terminate it, and just, broad field operations, movements of stock in and out and so on. Good record keeping is really important for that. But also evidencing those practices. So you've got the management record, but then we also use the Soil Mentor app, which is a really handy way for farmers to just be taking photos and making notes of management as they're doing it. And so together you've got the record and then the evidence of those things taking place. We've obviously got the rigorous measurements of the carbon itself from agricarbon. And then the really key bit is a process called validation and verification. And so there are bodies, we're working with a firm called Asta Global, who come and independently audit all of these three above things, the records, the evidence, and the measurements, to make sure that what we're saying is happening is in fact happening. The carbon we're claiming to be sequestered is in fact being sequestered. And that goes along with site visits as well. And what you end up with is a really kind of high integrity thing, that there's a high degree of confidence that the claims being made are in fact occurring, and that then results in a kind of premium price for that product. And so just to close, I'll just talk through a few features within the verified carbon standard, which is the program we work with, that ensure this high integrity. And they're kind of a bit fiddly, and sometimes there's a bit of confusion around them, but the reason why they're worth having essentially is because the confidence that gives buyers in the carbon credit commands a premium and kind of justifies the hassle from the perspective of Regenerate and the farmer. So the first thing is around the risk of reversal. So say you're doing really great things on your farm, but then the farm changes hands, you decide to perhaps revert from a regenerative approach to a different approach or what have you. There's always a risk in whatever we're doing that carbon that's sequestered now, that good work might be undone in 5, 10, 20 years' time. And so there's a deduction from the total Vera program of around 10 to 20% of carbon credits generated to account for the risk of reversal. And so that means that when someone buys a carbon credit, they know that even if a farm has a change in circumstances and can no longer continue down the regenerative path for whatever reason, that there's enough carbon kind of in that buffer, that reserve pool, to cover any risks of good work being undone somewhere else. The second thing is around uncertainty. So because soils are really variable, when change is measured, you kind of get a handle of what the total amount of change has been, but there's uncertainty around that due to the variation. And so what programs like Vera will allow you to do is generate credits up to a certain amount. So you've got really high confidence that, the credits generated represent actual sequestration. So for example, from the data, it might appear that, say, 2.5 tons of carbon have been sequestered, but actually there's quite a lot of uncertainty around that last half ton. So you could say, right, well, we're definitely going to get 2 really high quality credits here. 2 tons will be credited, but then, where there's that bit of uncertainty, that will kind of be held back again, just so there's a high confidence that the credits represent actual carbon sequestered. And then there's this thing around leakage. And leakage is essentially the risk of unintended consequences. So a great example of this would be, for example, calls to reduce livestock production in the UK, think of on a big scale. And so say, livestock numbers in the UK halved, but demand for meat didn't change, those that lamb and beef would be produced somewhere else, potentially with a higher emissions impact. And so that's kind of a big example of where, you know, doing something that reduces emissions over here can have an unintended consequence over, you know, somewhere else, potentially on the other side of the world. But it can also happen on a much smaller scale. So, for example, if someone joined a carbon program and said, right, I know that spreading manure sequesters loads of carbon, so I'm going to go and buy loads of manure from all my neighbours and spread it all on my farm. Well, those neighbours were already spreading that muck on their fields, and that was having a carbon benefit on their farm. So if you start spreading that muck on your farm rather than their farm, yes, you're putting carbon in your soil, but that carbon's no longer going into their soil. And so there needs to be a process to make sure that, you know, we're not just reallocating where carbon is being sequestered, we're actually achieving overall increases in the amount of carbon being sequestered. And the final thing is just making sure that other sources of farm emissions don't increase more than we're sequestering soil carbon. So say, for example, a silly example, but imagine driving your tractor lots, sequestered carbon. So you're burning loads of diesel and releasing loads of CO2 to generate a carbon increase. Not that this would happen, but just as an example, you know, it's to stop this kind of perverse incentives for people to increase emissions of one thing more than the carbon they're actually sequestering. And so these are a few of the things that we're kind of taking care of in the background to kind of put that evidence forward to the validation body on farm's behalf to generate these really high quality units. And so just to close by saying that, you know, the Regenerate program will kind of cover all aspects of this. So the mentoring with Understanding Ag, the ability to measure your carbon with agricarbon, evidence your actions using the Soil Mentor app, and then kind of handling the paperwork essentially to go through the verified carbon standard and meet that audit requirement so that farms can concentrate on doing what we enjoy, which is the farming side of things, but then benefit from having these really high quality units to sell at the end of it. And without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Bill to talk to us a bit more about the carbon market in the UK and where these credits can go to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, and some excellent technical presentations here. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm going to give you a much more higher level, brief insight into carbon markets themselves and how they operate. And hopefully that will sort of round off the excellent presentations that you've had so far. Let me just share my screen. And can let me know if you can see that.
Yes.
Yeah, we okay? How's that? Okay.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much. So yeah, my name is Bill Goldie. I'm a senior carbon advisor with a company called Redshaw Advisors. Redshaw Advisors themselves are environmental risk management consultants with a very strong focus on the carbon markets. Our founder, Lewis Redshaw, who put the Redshaw into Redshaw Advisors, has been in and around the carbon market since the very beginning and started Redshaw Advisors in 2014. And just one more little interesting fact about Lewis. Lewis is the UK authorities' expert witness on all or any carbon fraud cases, which thankfully are a lot less than they were in the early days. So I just wanted to share that so that you understood exactly who we are and the sort of values that Lewis Redshaw holds us to. So, you know, why do we need this? And I know this was touched on a little bit by Matt earlier, but basically the Paris Agreement in 2015 took us on a slightly different path where all countries got together to say that they were going to cooperate to try and stay below 1.5 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels. And if not 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees was a real maximum target. And what you can see in this graph is as much as we can reduce and decarbonise organisations, companies and states, it's not going to be enough. We need to start removing CO2 from the atmosphere as well. So the dark blue under the line highlights the need for emissions to be removed. And we need to use every tool available to us. And by no means is the carbon market the answer on its own, but it plays a small but important part in helping to create carbon pricing. That carbon pricing creates discussions at CFO level, where as carbon gets to a certain price, it becomes more attractive to actually invest in decarbonising rather than to continue to pay the cost of carbon itself. And effectively, that is what we're going to talk about tonight, very briefly, is there's two key markets for carbon. Some of you may already have heard of compliance markets, some of you may know it. It's state-run emission trading schemes, and these are fully regulated. There are the biggest scheme in existence is the EU ETS, the European Emission Trading Scheme. Since Brexit, we've now got a much smaller UK emission trading scheme, which runs along exactly the same lines as the European Union's. And what do we like about this? It's regulated. It's a transparent price. There's only one unit, a EUA or a UKA. So transactional costs for buyers are significantly lower because everybody knows what the price is. What we probably like less about it is that the money goes straight to governments. And certainly in the UK, that's not mandated in a legal way to be used on decarbonisation, although, of course, they claim the vast majority of it is. So the only seller in compliance markets is the governments themselves. In Europe, they auction what is known as allowances every day. And those are either bought at auction or in the secondary market after the auction through traders. And that is a significant difference. It's in the UK, the auctions once every 2 weeks because it's a much smaller, rather a liquid market. Now, just to give you some interesting facts on this, when Redshaw Advisor started in 2014, the price of an EUA was around €6. Today, it was just under €90. So although all markets have volatility, fundamentals and technicals that bring prices up and down, what we can see is the cap and trade system that has been designed, where it's been designed to continually reduce the amount of free allocations the companies that are compliant to be in these markets. So any company or organisation that is emitting more than 20 megawatts of thermal power have to comply within the emission trading schemes. And in 2022, the transactional value of the European emission trading scheme was around €800 billion. Just to give you a little bit of scale, the voluntary carbon market in 2022 was roughly $1 billion. So you can see that there's still significant headroom. But that showed progress because just a few years before that, the voluntary carbon market's transactional value was more like 300 million. So we did see significant growth. Like all markets, it gets stalled by macroeconomics, the war in Ukraine, higher interest rates, higher energy costs. It's put other pressures onto corporates. And so the big growth that we've seen in the voluntary carbon market in 2021 is certainly slowed down significantly over 2022 and where we're into in 2023 so far. The reason really is it is what it says. It's a voluntary market. It's not obligatory. And there's also been some negative scrutiny around some of the methodologies and the way that the markets run, which I'm going to touch on later. But the two systems should never be confused. They're non-fungible. The carbon credits created in the voluntary market cannot be used to replace an allowance in the compliance markets. Let's look a little bit more into the voluntary carbon market. Matt has already touched on this. Every carbon credit equates to 1 tonne of CO2, either avoided or removed from the atmosphere. And we're going to look at some of these methodologies shortly. But the way the market was designed was companies who have got residual emissions that they're unable to decarbonise, or it's too expensive to decarbonise at a point in time, could invest in projects that can avoid or remove carbon, thus creating the much needed investment into those projects and allowing those corporates to showcase their environmental responsibility. And that's the fundamentals of the voluntary carbon market, creating finance into projects in regions where the cost of avoidance or removal is less than doing it yourself. It's how markets operate. And efficient markets almost always start with more supply than demand. And as demand grows, prices increase, like we've seen in the compliance markets, and that creates more decarbonisation because the price of offsetting becomes to a point where it actually makes more sense to decarbonise the organisation you're in. So that's what Mark Carney, who ran our task force, reckons that we have to get this market to 50 billion for it to start making a difference. And I'm going to talk in a minute about the changes within the market that are taking place to help get that sort of scale into the business, into the markets. Since the start of the voluntary carbon market in the sort of 2007, the market has been dominated by carbon avoidance, and in particular, 2 main project types. One was renewables. When the carbon markets were first launched, it enabled huge utility scale projects, mainly out of Asia, massive megawatts of solar and wind, biomass and hydro to create carbon credits. And in those early days, there was nowhere near the demand for the amount of supply that was coming in. And the other very popular project type around the sort of co-benefits it came with was protecting forests, known as REDD+, but effectively compensating communities in the developing world around the Amazon tropics in Africa so that they can survive as communities without chopping down their trees. The reality is that we chopped down, I think, about 90% of our trees since the Industrial Revolution. And until such time as there's another mechanism to compensate those communities, this is the best that we have. But it has come under significant scrutiny recently. These methodologies were put together 20 years ago when we didn't have satellite technology, we didn't have AI, we didn't have a lot of the skills and intelligence that we have now. And actually trying to figure out how many credits a forest that's 1,000-year-old should generate by not chopping it down was incredibly difficult. And these projects are all now going back through new methodology reviews on a more jurisdictional basis to make the integrity of those projects a lot more comfortable. But the market itself, since we've gone on to this pathway to net zero, has started really trending towards projects that remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And that's really split into 2 types of projects. You've got nature-based projects, Wayne talked about beautifully earlier, and how we can sequester. And the original idea of planting trees is just not practical in terms of the amount of space you need and the time it takes. But regenerative agriculture, if done properly, can generate huge volumes of removal credits that those corporates looking to get to net zero and understanding that nobody can decarbonise to zero themselves will have to invest in to meet their goals. what nature-based, and I think Matt touched on this earlier, it does have permanence concerns. Unlike what we see in the bottom is technology-based solutions like bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, direct air capture. These are incredibly expensive. We're not really sure if they're ever going to be able to scale, but what they do give you is significant permanence as part of their methodologies. So the market is trending from the left to the right. The market will have to pay significantly more for these credits than they paid for China wind or Indian solar credits, which tended to be, because of the significant oversupply, at one point were as low as $1 per carbon credit. So this is where we're trending to. The market has, as well as the macroeconomics, has come under scrutiny from environmental groups for several reasons. One, some of the environmental groups think we should not be generating any emissions at all, and by creating carbon markets, their view is that it gives corporates the opportunity to carry on emitting. We believe there needs to be a pragmatic view to this. You know, if we waited for perfection, we wouldn't have one single project that's had anything invested into it, but we do need to continually improve the integrity of the projects and the knowledge of the corporates in terms of how they message their ambitions and their successes. And we can cover that shortly. So although we've stated that the voluntary carbon market is unregulated, so effectively you can say what you like, do what you like, it's not really the case, because sitting above these markets is green claims code, and very similar in Europe and UK. It was introduced to European Parliament in March, and that's going to set out very strict guidelines about what corporates have to go through in terms of disclosures, what scopes that they're using, what supply chain emissions they've looked at, how much they've decarbonised themselves versus how much they've invested in projects elsewhere. And those corporates that are seen to pull the wool over their consumers' eyes can and will face quite significant litigation. And I think everybody welcomes that. But what the corporates need is clear guidelines and possibly regulation on those disclosures, so that it's not just a case of an organisation not quite understanding the terminologies and trying to do something good and effectively then creating a real negative through scrutiny from elsewhere. So this is the help that's on its way very much. The organisation that claimed the first net zero standard was the Science Based Targets Initiative. It's fairly robust. It requires corporates and organisations to decarbonise by as much as 90 to 95% by 2050. And the only projects that they can count after they've decarbonised is carbon removals, like regeneration ag, unlike the avoidance credits. And what we've got in the background here is, on the right-hand side, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, which was co-founded by the UK government. And this is, and it's got a whole raft of NGOs and organisations and experts working as consultants within the VCMI, looking to create rules on disclosures for corporates, so that it can understand exactly what is possible and what's not, and how to message that out. And they're bringing out a claims code of practice, and they're working extremely closely to what we see on the left, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. And this group of NGOs and organisations, I think there's over 250 organisations involved, are looking to go beyond the validation that Matt spoke about at Vera, who have been, are still working on methodologies and practices which are proven to be not good enough to create the integrity that we need to move the dial. And they're looking at new core carbon principles. They're looking at governance, emission impacts and sustainable development. Effectively, we looked at 10 core principles. The key ones really that we look at every day are additionality. Would that project have happened if it didn't have carbon finance? A great example is the renewable projects I spoke about earlier. Renewable projects have no longer allowed any new projects since 2020 because the cost of constructing renewables at utility scale is now far less costly than it was when the carbon markets came out back in 2005 to 2007. So we have to look at additionality and they look at permanence. How permanent, how likely is this to be reversed? And what other sustainable developments, what other co-benefits are these projects looking at? And there's no doubt going forward that corporates are going to be paying massive attention to projects that have either got CCP approval or haven't got CC approval. It's going to become another layer of comfort for them that they're not going to invest in a project that is found wanting down the line. There's BSI are bringing out their own, they've been better known for their carbon neutrality standards, the international standards, but they're bringing their own the net zero framework and a new standard called ISO 1468. And what you'll see is they're all very similar now. They're obviously all talking to each other. They want to create more trust, more understanding for organisations on what is possible and how to achieve it. And I apologise if that was a little bit rushed. Normally we could have all-day workshops on a fraction of the carbon market discussions that we've had today. I just really wanted to finish by saying, you know, we've now seen, when you see like an EUA price at €89, that is not a carbon price for the voluntary carbon market. At the moment, one of the problems with the voluntary carbon market is every project has got its own pricing, depending on the project type, the region, the vintage, and various other determinations. And what we believe is we need to try and create more of an understanding on pricing so that the vast majority of investment from corporates, we make sure that that goes to the projects themselves and doesn't get stuck in the secondary trading markets, which are really adding no value to the fight against climate. So thank you very much for allowing me to run through the carbon markets, and happy to take any questions if there are any.
Bill, is it worth you taking that question about what kind of companies have their emissions cap in the UK compliance market? I'm assuming it's the very large industrials.
It's all, anyone who generates more than 20 megawatts of thermal power per year. And what these organisations have is they've got their emissions. They then have a thing called free allocations, without getting into too much detail, because there's a thing called carbon leakage. So the free allocations was put to try and create a level playing field from products that were coming in from regions which didn't have emission trading schemes like Asia and others. That's been superseded in 2026 by a thing called a carbon border adjustment mechanism. But effectively, whether it's a pharmaceutical company, a university, a cement manufacturer, steel, aluminium, generators themselves, power generators, anybody that is 20 megawatts or above, the aviation sector, and as of 2024, maritime. So maritime's, they're bringing shipping in as well. So they're continuing to add demand and reduce free allocations in a way that's guaranteed to increase the price of carbon over time. And the idea is that we hope that does a lot of the heavy lifting in decarbonising Europe, the UK, and other regions that are now following with their own emission trading schemes.
Thank you, Bill. And there are a few more questions. So there's one about the ideal time of year for the Eurofins soil tests. So in answer to that one, on the soil biology front, I believe 12 degrees C is the kind of cutoff. So soil biology starts to slow down significantly below that. That's separate to the soil carbon analysis, which we can explain another time. And yes, the aim is that our program can help in the interpretation of these analyses. Well, I sat in on a recent meeting between Understanding Ag and one of our farms, and the PLFA, for example, showed that the fungal and predator ratios are too low, and it actually harked back to their 634 management system to try and remedy those imbalances, and that would have the impact of improving the soil aggregation, which improves the drawing of the nutrients, etc. So a lot of the analysis actually does link back to the management training, which we can again explain another time. There is a question from Chris. Will an arable farm converting to regen ag be able to make more money from sequestration than a grassland farm? I.e., does an arable farm have greater potential? Matt, do you want to cover this briefly? We don't have a huge amount of time left, but
I'll take note of the briefly, Tom. Yeah, so obviously, if you've got an arable farm that's maybe conventionally managed for a long time and has quite a low carbon stock, and then you try to transition that to really excellent regenerative pasture management, then yeah, they are kind of the two extremes. So if you went from degraded arable to really healthy pasture, that would be the most amount of carbon you could sequester within that kind of agricultural context. But within an arable system, there's often a lot of room for improvement, and within a pasture system, there'll be room for improvement. And so, you know, within arable farmland kept as arable, and pasture kept as pasture, you know, there's definitely substantial potential in both. The exact amount of carbon sequestered in an arable versus a pasture system kept within those systems will depend on the soil type and the exact management you're doing, your management history before that. But I think that there's definitely a lot to play for in both of those systems. And then maybe just to quickly also take the kind of second question around whether farms are better off waiting and hanging back before entering the carbon markets on the basis that prices will hopefully increase. So that the really important thing to bear in mind there is that you can't generate any credits until you've had your baseline taken. So if you held off from joining a program until 5-10 years in the future, you would start generating credits at that point in time. Whereas if you join a program and get your carbon baselined now, then you can start accruing credits from this point. And those credits that have a vintage essentially relating to the year or years in which they were generated. And within the Regenerate program, you can choose to either hold your credits yourselves or have them sold on your behalf and get the cash for them. But Bill can maybe touch on a little bit around the value of credits at the time they're generated versus credits from previous years sold in a year. Bill, do you want to say a little bit about vintages and how the price?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, vintage is a factor, but it's only a factor if they're very old. When we go back to renewables and projects that were generated back 10 years ago, are considerably less valuable than a renewable project at vintage in 2022. However, within a few, within anything from sort of 5 years in, the vintage is not massively significant, and we believe that there's going to be corporates who are going to need to have project credits in place by 2030 to meet their interim targets, and we are certainly pushing them that way at the moment, because everything is driven. The only price driver is supply and demand. It's not what someone decides that they're going to sell or buy for. It's supply and demand in these markets drive it. And the drive to net zero is going to drive a specific type of project, which the Regen Ag fits that bill for. I don't see any any real benefit in losing these years' credits. I would, if you wanted to generate them and hold them, that would make more sense.
Thanks, Bill. There's a question: what are the risks to the farmer of entering the voluntary carbon market? Just from my side on this, we've designed this program so that the farm can exit at any time because of the unknowns related to the carbon markets which are appearing in this space. Also linking back to the mentoring program, essentially we've designed it so that the farm can farm how they want to and receive this layer of strategic advice from Understanding Ag. So in terms of the farm business and its production core, if you like, we're hoping that actually benefits from the program as opposed to being put at risk. We're very aware of not essentially coercing farms to do activities which aren't suitable for their context, which Understanding Ag are very, they centre their mentoring around that process. So that's tying back into our program. But and sorry, one final note is compared to biodiversity net gain, for example, where there's a covenant with a local planning authority, the carbon market factors in non-permanence, so you can exit, and any credits that have been registered and cleared and sold, they're not affected by any future decisions by the farm. In other words, they are cleared off the registry. So in that regard, the carbon market is actually more flexible than some of these other environmental markets, which imply quite restrictive contracts with various parties. So does anyone else on the panel want to say a word about that? Or I have one question for Understanding Ag left. If there are no more questions. My question for Understanding Ag is about the consumption of carbon in the soils, and so it's for Shane and Blaine and Kyle, because it was evident at one of the recent academies about how if you don't apply the principles of soil health, there are risks that you can actually deplete your soil carbon stocks, as Blaine was explaining at the beginning. But I don't know if you guys wanted to say a comment on that, and how the 634 management system ensures that you're continuously building carbon stocks and protecting that reserve. In particular, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, where if you apply too much synthetic nitrogen, that can lead to the microbiology reacting and consuming a lot of the carbon which is in the ground, for example. So I don't know if Understanding Ag want to touch on that.
I guess I'll start, and I see Shane just came back, so he might talk about nitrogen, but I guess it's important to measure that, to understand that it's a flow. It's continually going in, continually going out. And so what we need to do in our regeneration is make more go in than goes out. But life itself, every breath I breathe is breathing out CO2, along with every other single living creature, whether it's in the soil or on the earth or whatever. So we need to be aware of that. And if we practice those 6 principles, we are going to be putting more carbon in than will be coming out. You want to talk about nitrogen, Shane?
Yeah, thank you for the reply there, Blaine. So obviously, when we talk about synthetic nutrient application or application of nitrogen, especially, obviously that nitrogen is being either utilized by the plant or a lot of it's being utilized by the microbiology. Obviously, they're consuming nitrogen. They have to offset that just like you and I do in our own daily diets. We consume proteins, nitrogen. We have to offset that with carbohydrates. It's the same that works within the soil structure itself with the microbiology. if we have excess of something such as nitrogen, the microbiology is going to be able to consume that nitrogen, and they have to offset that with carbon. So as they consume carbon, that's less is being, retained or captured within the soil structure. And we're talking about aerobic systems here at the present moment, but it's a pretty broad overview. We have several webinars on our website that go in this subject matter a little more in depth.
Yeah, thanks, Shane and Ben. I don't think there are any more questions, so just to say thank you very much to all the panelists. It's been very interesting, and I think that's going to wrap it up.